The wind rolled across the foothills of the Alps with a sharp, biting chill, carrying with it the smell of damp earth, pine resin, and distant snow. In the dim light of an early autumn dawn, a line of soldiers stirred within a makeshift camp scattered among boulders and gnarled trees. Cloaks were pulled tight around shoulders, and shields were stacked in uneven piles, their bronze rims dulled by weeks of grueling travel. Fires smouldered in shallow pits, more smoke than flame, barely enough to warm stiff fingers. Among them moved a man whose name already carried the weight of legend, Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, commander of the Carthaginian host that had marched from Iberia with elephants, infantry, and fierce Numidian riders. His face, marked by the scars of past campaigns, remained unreadable as he walked between tents made of hide and wool. He spoke little, but his presence alone was enough to pull tired men upright. They had crossed rivers that swallowed horses whole, climbed slopes where even goats hesitated, and endured ambushes from tribes who vanished back into forests after striking like ghosts. Yet they still followed him, trusting a promise spoken long ago in the temples of Carthage, that Rome would one day kneel or bleed. A young soldier named Mago warmed his hands over a dying fire, his breath hanging in the air like mist. He had left New Carthage months earlier, imagining glory, plunder, and songs. The reality was mud, hunger, and the memory of comrades swept away by icy torrents tumbling down from the high passes. Still, when Hannibal walked near, Mago stood straighter and pretended his hands did not shake. Farther down, a group of Gauls, mercenaries recruited with promises of gold and spoils, argued in their own language over a skin of watered wine. They were broad-shouldered men with tangled hair and tattoos spiralling across their arms. Though they did not love Carthage, they hated Rome enough to fight under any banner that offered a chance to spill Roman blood. The elephants shifted restlessly at the edge of the camp, their massive forms draped in rough blankets. Steam curled from their trunks, and the crunch of their feet against the frosted ground echoed faintly. One of the handlers, a wiry man from the deserts beyond the Atlas Mountains, whispered calming words in a tongue no one else understood. The beasts were both symbol and weapon. Living towers meant to strike fear in enemies who had never seen such creatures outside faded myths. Hannibal paused near a flat stone where a roughly sketched map lay weighed down with a dagger. A few of his officers gathered. Hasdrubal, stern and calculating, Maharbal, commander of the cavalry, his eyes burning with an impatience that could ignite into fury at a moment's notice, and Sir Silas, the Greek historian who served as advisor and chronicler. They spoke quietly, voices low, aware that even whispers travelled easily in the stillness. Below them, beyond the rising slope and patches of thinning trees, lay the lands that fed the Roman Republic. Italia, rich and guarded, waited beyond the last teeth of the mountains. Roman scouts had undoubtedly heard rumours, a foreign army crossing the Alps before the first deep snow. Some in the camp believed the Romans would laugh at such tales, dismissing them as superstition. Others feared Rome would be waiting on the other side with legions of disciplined soldiers ready to crush them the moment they emerged from the passes. The first rays of sunlight crawled across the jagged peaks, turning the tips white with fire. Frost shimmered on the helmets of soldiers stepping out to gather water from streams forged by melting ice. Mago's friend, a Libyan veteran named Abdar, muttered that the mountains themselves seemed determined to kill them before any Roman sword touched their flesh. As the camp slowly came alive, word spread that Hannibal would speak before they resumed the crossing. Men left their fires, pulling cloaks around their armour, some leaning on spears, others wiping sleep from their eyes. Even the Gauls shoved one another into silence when Hannibal climbed a low rock to be seen above the crowd. He did not shout. His voice, though not loud, carried with the clarity of iron striking stone. He reminded them of why they had come, not for comfort, but for vengeance, not for safety, but for the chance to break the pride of Rome. He said that beyond the mountains lay plains where their horses would run without stumbling, cities ripe with grain and wine, and enemies who believed themselves untouchable. He did not offer promises of easy victory, only the certainty that history favoured those who dared what others feared. When he finished, a murmur rose among the ranks. Some thumped spear shafts against shields, others simply stared ahead, jaws clenched with a determination born from suffering too great to abandon. Maharbal stepped close to Hannibal after the crowd returned to their duties. "They will follow you into the jaws of the gods themselves," he said quietly. Hannibal gave no reply. Not far away, 2 Numidian scouts returned from the heights above. Their cloaks were stiff with frost, their cheeks hollow from the cold. They reported shattered paths and new snowdrifts forming overnight, but the way was still. Passable. Barely. Roman patrols had not yet been sighted on this side of the range. Hannibal nodded and dismissed them with a glance. By midday the camp was dismantled. Packs were loaded onto mules, armour tightened, and the column formed with the elephants at the rear to avoid panic among the pack animals. The sky remained a pale blue dome streaked with grey, and the wind sighed through the pines like a warning. Mago and Abdar trudged near the centre of the marching line. The path twisted between jagged stones and patches of ice that glittered like broken glass. Every step sent pain through their calves, and each breath burned in their lungs, yet they did not speak of turning back. To return was impossible. Behind them lay months of blood and toil. Ahead lay the promise of a clash that would decide whether their hardships had purpose. As they climbed higher, the world narrowed to rock, ice, and the slow beat of their feet. In the distance wolves howled, their cries carried by currents of cold air. Some soldiers muttered prayers to Baal Hammon or Tanit. Others carried small charms taken from their homes, scraps of cloth, bits of carved bone, a lock of hair tied around a wrist. By the time the sun dipped behind the peaks again, the army had reached a plateau where the remnants of a burned village lay scattered among the snow. Charred beams jutted from drifts like ribs of some fallen beast. Pots shattered by heat lay half buried, and a broken cart wheel protruded from a blackened wall. No bodies remained, only the echo of violence faded by time. Maharbal ordered a temporary halt. Fires were lit with difficulty, the wood damp and reluctant to burn. Hannibal walked among the ruins in silence, boots crunching across ash frozen into the ground. He paused at a collapsed doorway, then looked toward the south where clouds gathered over the next rise. "We will not stop long," Hasdrubal said, more statement than question. Hannibal answered only with a faint nod. As night took hold, the men huddled close to their fires, the glow flickering across faces hollowed by cold and hunger. Somewhere beyond the dark horizon were the fields of the Po Valley, the roads that led to the heart of Roman power. The mountains crouched behind them like monstrous guardians, waiting to see whether the strangers who dared to cross would survive or fall among the stones. And in the quiet moments before sleep, even the bravest could not help but wonder whether the Romans had already begun to dream of them, like a distant storm creeping closer with every heartbeat. The morning broke without colour. The sky a pale sheet spread across the peaks. The wind had not rested, and its teeth were sharper now, prying. Through cloaks and biting at ears and fingers, Hannibal's army stirred again among the blackened remnants of the ruined village, stamping frost from their boots and coaxing stubborn embers into flame. No one spoke of the place they had slept, among ashes and silence, but many glanced over their shoulders as if expecting the ghosts of those who had died there to rise with the sun. By the time the first thin warmth filtered through the clouds, the column was on the move again. The path narrowed, carved into the mountainside by hands long vanished, hugging cliffs that plunged into a misty abyss. At some turns, men had to press their backs to the stone wall and inch sideways so as not to slip into the void below. The elephants advanced slowly, their handlers calling soft commands, testing each step before committing their massive weight. As sometimes the animals paused and refused to move until ropes were tied and the way ahead cleared of the jagged rock. Mago walked in silence, his breath forming thin trails in the cold air. Abdar marched beside him, lips cracked and fingers wrapped in wool strips that did little to keep the chill away. They passed a section of the path where snowfall had buried the ground unevenly. The men in front struggled through the drifts, leaning on spears for balance. More than once someone lost footing and slid several paces before others caught them by the arms. In the middle of the day, a shout rose from the vanguard. The column halted, the motion rippling backward like a shiver. Mago craned his neck but saw only a curve in the path disappearing behind boulders. Word spread that stones had crashed down the mountainside ahead, blocking the way. Some swore it was the work of hostile tribes hiding in the heights. Others muttered that the mountain itself sought to crush them before they reached the plains. Hannibal rode forward on horseback, though the animal struggled on the frozen path. Officers and a group of agile soldiers followed, climbing to inspect the damage. The fallen rocks were massive, splintered from the cliffs above and tangled with uprooted brush. Clearing them would take hours, perhaps a day. The officers debated whether to turn back and try another pass, but Mahabal argued that time was already slipping through their fingers like sand. The men were ordered to rest while a team set to work with picks and ropes. Fires were kindled where space allowed, and those nearest huddled around them, rubbing hands and rotating to warm each side in turn. Mago chewed a strip of dried meat from the last rations issued days ago. It tasted of salt and old leather, but he forced it down. Hunger had ceased to feel like pain and become a dull emptiness that sat behind his ribs. As the rocks were heaved aside, Sosilus the historian took the opportunity to walk among the troops. He asked questions in calm tones, wanting to record the ordeal they had endured. How many men froze in the night? How many? Animals fell and were left behind. How many days without fresh bread? Some answered with bitter humour, others ignored him completely. Few believed that words could preserve anything of value if they died before reaching Italia. By late afternoon, rubble had been pushed enough for men to pass in single file. The column lurched forward once more, slower now, each step a test of endurance. The path ascended sharply, and soon they reached a crest where the wind roared without mercy. From there the world opened to the south, a vast expanse of hills and valleys, still distant but free of the jagged teeth of the Alps. The men paused, and for a moment even the Gauls fell silent. But the descent was worse than the climb. The trail on the southern face of the mountains was slick with ice hiding beneath thin layers of snow. Hooves slipped, wheels skidded, and more than one mule tumbled into the ravine, its terrified braying cut short by impact. The elephants had to be guided along a different route, their weight threatening to shatter the path beneath them. Abdar nearly fell while helping lift a cartwheel from a crevice. Mago grabbed his arm in time, but in doing so lost his own footing and scraped his knuckles against the ice-coated rock. Blood welled briefly before the cold sealed the wound. They exchanged no words, only nods, and continued downward. As dusk settled, the army reached a narrow ledge where the wind finally eased. Hannibal called a halt there, though the ground was uneven and the snow deep. Fires were lit again, their glow flickering against the darkening sky. Mahabal ordered scouts ahead to search for a suitable place to descend into the valley below. While the men ate what little remained of their rations, Hannibal spoke quietly with his officers beneath a jutting ledge of stone. Sosilus joined them briefly, listening. He heard Hasdrubal argue that their numbers were shrinking too fast, that by the time they reached the plains, the Romans would outnumber them 10-1. Mahabal countered that the enemy would not expect an army to emerge from the mountains at this time of year, and their surprise would be their greatest weapon. Hannibal said little, but when he did speak, the others fell silent. He reminded them that their march was not born of hope, but of necessity. Rome had humiliated Carthage once, stripped it of ships and tribute. If they retreated now, the Republic would hunt them even across the sea. The only path forward was through hardship, into the enemy's heart. Night fell wholly then, swallowing the peaks in darkness. The stars came out sharp and cold, scattered across the sky like fragments of broken shields. Mago lay wrapped in his cloak beside Abdar and a few others, his back pressed against a rock still faintly warm from the fire. He watched his breath rise and vanish, his thoughts drifting to the sun-baked streets of New Carthage, to the smell of olives and roasting fish. Those memories felt like stories told in another lifetime. A scream cut through the night, short and sudden. Men leapt to their feet, hands on daggers, but it was only a mule that had slipped and fallen from a ledge above. They listened to it crash down the slope, the sound fading into silence. Sleep came in snatches, broken by the howl of wind and the shifting of snow beneath restless feet. Somewhere among the fires a Gaul began to sing in a low, mournful voice, his native tongue thick with despair and stubborn pride. The song drifted through the camp, weaving around stones and sleeping men, until even those who did not understand felt the weight of it settle over them. Before dawn, the scouts returned and reported a route that led to a broad valley where the snow thinned and the ground showed patches of frozen earth. Hannibal ordered the column to rise before the sky lightened. Men groaned but obeyed, stamping feeling back into their limbs. The march resumed down a steep slope where ropes were strung between rocks to keep the elephants from sliding. As they descended, the air gradually grew warmer, though still cold enough to sting the lungs. The trees thickened, pines giving way to bare-limbed oaks that rattled in the wind. They passed carcasses of animals that had fallen long before, their bones picked clean by unseen scavengers. The path widened at last, allowing the soldiers to walk two abreast. By midday they reached the mouth of the valley. Before them stretched low hills dusted with snow, and beyond that faint smoke rising from distant settlements. Mago paused, staring across the landscape, his mind struggling to grasp that they had crossed the Alps alive. Behind him, Hannibal stood and looked southward, his face unreadable. The mountains loomed behind them like a wall of stone and memory. Ahead lay the lands of Rome, wide and waiting. The army continued forward, leaving the last shadows of the peaks behind. And though no one spoke it aloud, every man felt the same truth stirring in his chest, that the crossing had not been their greatest trial. The real struggle was only beginning, and the Romans had not yet seen the storm descending upon their fields.